In the spring of 1944, a woman named Eleanor Pruitt opened the front door of a narrow two-story house on Delancey Street in a mill town in Pennsylvania and stood there holding a telegram she had already read 4 times. Her husband, a machinist, was not coming home. He was 38 years old. He left her with 3 children under 12, a mortgage with 11 years still owed on it, and a checking account that held $41. The mill offered her nothing. The bank offered her sympathy and a payment schedule. Her own mother told her, gently, that there was no shame in selling the house and moving the children into rooms. Eleanor did not sell the house. When she died in that same house in 1971, the deed was paid in full. 2 of her children had finished college, and the 3rd owned a hardware store across the river. The neighbors said she must have had help from somewhere. She did not. What she had was a way of running a household that her grandmother had taught her during the last war. A set of habits so ordinary in 1944 that no one thought them worth naming, and so completely abandoned by 1974 that her own grandchildren would have called them poverty. They were not poverty. They were control. We forgot what these women knew. We forgot that an entire generation of widows kept their family homes on a fraction of what we earn now, not because life was cheaper, but because they had mastered a discipline we traded away for convenience. We forgot that the woman who could make $1 do the work of 3 was not pitiable. She was the most powerful person on her street, and the bank knew it. Number 28 on this list is something a modern financial planner would charge you good money to learn, and Eleanor did it every Friday night with a shoebox. Number 14 was so common in 1945 that no one wrote it down, and a university study now calls the same idea a cornerstone of staying solvent through a shock. And number 1, the rule Eleanor held more fiercely than any other, is the reason a $41 account became a paid-off house. These 30 habits were never about doing without. They were about refusing to lose the one thing that could not be replaced. If you want to understand how those women did it, subscribe now, and let us count down the 30 lost budgeting habits widows in the 1940s used to keep the family home. Number 30. The room that paid the taxes. Almost every widow with a spare bedroom took in a boarder. A school teacher, a young nurse, a war worker far from home, a quiet older man who had lost his own family. The rent was rarely large, $4 or $5 a week, but it arrived the same day every week, and it never argued. A widow in Ohio in 1945 rented her late son's room to a telephone operator and covered the entire winter coal bill on that money alone. The boarder was not a stranger in the house. The boarder was a payment that walked in the door, ate quietly, and kept the lights on. The empty room was the most expensive room in the house, and the widow who understood that never let it stay empty. Number 29. The garden planted for the cellar. A widow's vegetable garden was not a hobby, and it was not for show. It was planted in spring with February in mind. Tomatoes, beans, beets, cabbage, and potatoes went into the ground in May so that jars of them could come up from the cellar in January. A mother in Indiana fed 4 children through the winter of 1946, almost entirely from what she had grown and put up the summer before, and the grocer downtown saw her only for flour, coffee, and salt. The garden was not free food. It was a grocery bill paid in July with sweat instead of cash, against a winter when cash would be the scarcest thing in the house. Number 28. The envelopes filled on Friday. Every widow who kept her home ran the household on a cash envelope system, and she ran it the same night the money came in. Rent or mortgage in one envelope, coal in another, food, insurance, school shoes, the church, each in its own. When an envelope was empty, the spending in that category was finished until the next Friday, and no envelope was ever robbed to feed another. A widow in Missouri kept 9 labeled envelopes in a shoebox on the top shelf of her closet for 20 years. The system did not depend on willpower. The money was already spoken for before she ever walked into a store, and you cannot overspend money that is already in someone else's envelope.
Number 27. The mortgage paid before the table was set. For a widow holding a family home, the house payment came before food, before clothes, before anything a child might beg for. She knew, with a clarity the bank counted on most people lacking, that a missed meal could be made up next week, but a missed payment started a clock that ended on the courthouse steps. A widow in Illinois in 1944 fed her children bread and milk for 3 days rather than touch the envelope marked with the bank's name. The payment was not a bill among bills. It was the roof itself, and she paid for the roof before she worried about what went on under it. Number 26. The hens in the back lot. A few hens in a backyard coop gave a widow eggs to eat, eggs to trade, and eggs to sell, all from kitchen scraps and garden weeds. A dozen hens could feed a family its eggs and still leave a surplus to carry to the corner store for credit against coffee and sugar. A widow in Tennessee in 1945 kept 8 hens behind her house and never bought an egg or a chicken for the pot in 9 years. The hens cost her almost nothing a household did not already throw away, and they paid her back every single morning before breakfast. The coop was not a barnyard. It was a small machine that turned scraps into food and food into store credit. Number 25. The clothes made over twice. A widow unpicked a worn dress and turned the cloth to its unfaded side. A man's suit kept after the funeral became a boy's good jacket, and then a younger boy's school trousers. Flour came in printed cotton sacks, and the sacks became aprons, curtains, and little girls' dresses. A mother in Texas clothed 3 children for a year on a few dollars of thread and buttons because the cloth itself was used 3 and 4 times before it ever became a rag. The clothing budget was not spent at the store. It was spent at the sewing machine by lamplight, and a widow who could sew well never paid full price for a child's coat in her life. Number 24. The fat saved and the soap made. Nothing greasy left a widow's kitchen as waste. Bacon drippings, meat trimmings, the fat skimmed from a soup pot, all went into a can on the back of the stove. Some of it cooked the next meal. The rest, when there was enough, was boiled down with lye into hard yellow bars of soap that washed the floors, the laundry, and the children. A widow in Kentucky in 1943 bought no cooking fat and no soap for years because the kitchen produced both from what most people poured down the drain. The fat can was not garbage. It was 2 household bills rendered out of scraps. Number 23. The day-old counter. A widow learned the rhythms of every shop that mattered. The baker marked down yesterday's bread in the morning. The butcher cut the price of meat near closing on Saturday. The grocer sold dented cans and bruised produce for pennies. A widow in New Jersey timed her shopping to those exact hours and fed her family on food that was perfectly good and half the price, simply because she arrived when the store was anxious to sell it. The discount was not luck. It was a schedule she kept in her head
and the few hours she spent walking to the right counter at the right time were the best paid hours of her week. Number 22. The coal burned in one room. Heat was one of the largest costs a widow faced, and she did not heat a house she could not afford to heat. In the coldest months, the family lived in the kitchen, where the cook stove was burning anyway, and the upstairs bedrooms went unheated behind closed doors. The children did their lessons at the kitchen table and went to bed under heavy quilts in cold rooms, warmed by bricks heated on the stove and wrapped in flannel. A widow in Wisconsin in 1944 cut her coal bill nearly in half by closing off 2/3 of the house from October to April. The cold rooms were not neglect. They were a heating bill she simply refused to pay. Number 21. The Christmas Club at the bank. Many a widow opened a Christmas Club account and paid into it a quarter or 50 cents a week all year long. It earned almost no interest, and that was not the point. The point was that the money went in automatically and could not easily be pulled back out, so that when December came, there was a small sum set aside for shoes and a goose and a few wrapped gifts, paid for without debt and without raiding the rent. A widow in Minnesota in 1946 never once borrowed for Christmas, because a year of nickels had already done the work. The club was not a savings account. It was a way of paying for December in January, one coin at a time, before the temptation to spend the money ever arose.
Number 20. The sewing taken in. A widow with a needle turned it into income. She hemmed, altered, and mended for the women on her street who could pay a little to look respectable. She turned collars on men's shirts and let out children's clothes for growing families. A widow in New York in 1945 brought in real money every week doing alterations at her own kitchen table while her children slept. Work that required no childcare, no car fare, and no boss. The needle was not a chore. It was a business she could run between the cradle and the stove, and it never once asked her to leave the house. In the years right after the war, a widow with children and a mortgage was one of the most financially exposed people in America. There was no social safety net as we know it now. Survivor benefits were thin or non-existent for many. The mill or the railroad or the factory owed her nothing, and a single bad month could end with a notice tacked to her door. And yet across the country, hundreds of thousands of these women kept their homes, raised their children, and buried not one of them in a pauper's grave. Researchers who have looked back at how poor households survived that era keep arriving at the same plain conclusion. It was almost never a single large income that saved a family. It was the layering of many small streams, the rent of a room, the eggs, the sewing, the garden, the relentless avoidance of debt, until no one of them mattered enough to sink the household if it failed. The widow who had 6 tiny incomes and owed nothing was far safer than the family next door with 1 good paycheck and a stack of installment payments. She had built a household that bent under pressure instead of breaking, and the bankers who expected her to fail simply watched her not fail year after year and never understood why. Number 19. The party line and the pencil. A telephone was a luxury, and a widow either did without one or shared a party line and used it strictly. She wrote letters instead of placing calls, walked a message to a neighbor instead of ringing, and kept the telephone, if she had one at all, for the doctor and for emergencies. A widow in Iowa in 1944 ran her entire household correspondence on 2-cent stamps and never paid for a long-distance call in her life. The silence on the line was not isolation.
It was a monthly bill kept small on purpose, in a decade when a single careless habit could quietly drain an envelope dry. Number 18. The bulk staple bought once. When a widow had a little cash, she did not buy a pound of flour. She bought a sack of it, and a sack of sugar, and beans by the bag, because the staples she would eat all year cost less bought whole than spooned out a little at a time. A widow in Nebraska in 1945 kept a flour barrel, a sugar tin, and crocks of beans and rice in her pantry, and bought them at harvest prices when they were cheapest. The full pantry was not hoarding. It was a year of bread bought at the low price instead of the high one, and a pantry that was already full could not be held hostage by a sudden jump in the cost of flour. Number 17. The war stamps stuck in the book. Through the war years, a widow bought savings stamps a dime at a time and pasted them into a book that, when full, became a war bond. It was patriotism, yes, but it was also forced saving, painless and slow. Money set aside in amounts so small she never missed them. A widow in Oregon in 1944 filled book after book with dimes her children helped paste in, and those bonds matured years later into the down payment on her daughter's first home. The stamp was not a sacrifice. It was a dime turned into a habit, and the habit turned into a bond, and the bond turned into a future no single dime could have bought. Number 16. The burial money kept apart. A widow who had already buried one person knew exactly what a funeral cost, and she made certain her own children would never face that bill unprepared. She paid a few cents a week to a burial society, or kept a small insurance policy, or simply held a sum in a separate place that was never, ever spent. A widow in South Carolina in 1946 kept her burial money sewn into the lining of a coat in the back of the closet. It was not morbid. It was the refusal to let her own death become one more debt laid on the children she had spent her life keeping out of debt.
Number 15. The walk instead of the fare. A streetcar ride cost a nickel, and a nickel, to a widow counting them, was real. She walked to church, walked to the shops, walked the children to school, and saved the fare for the days when weather or distance left no choice. A widow in Massachusetts in 1945 calculated that walking saved her better than $15 a year, which was a week's groceries, simply by using her own 2 feet for distances a streetcar could have carried her. The walk was not deprivation. It was a grocery bill earned back a nickel at a time on legs that asked for nothing in return. Number 14. The book balanced every Friday night. Every widow who kept her home kept a book, and it was not a budget so much as a confession. Every penny that came in and every penny that went out was written down in a ledger and totaled at the end of the week. A widow in Ohio reviewed her book every Friday for 30 years and always knew, to the dollar, exactly where she stood. A modern university study of household financial resilience now points to regular self-review as one of the habits most strongly tied to surviving a financial shock. These women did it by hand at the kitchen table in 1945. The book did not scold, and it did not flatter. It only told the truth, and a widow who read the truth every Friday was never ambushed by the first of the month. Number 13. The thing mended before it was replaced. A cracked plate was riveted. A worn sheet was cut down the middle and sewn back together with the strong edges to the center. A run in a stocking was caught before it spread, and shoes were resoled again and again before a new pair was even considered.
A widow in Michigan in 1944 kept a small kit of needles, thread, glue, and tacks, and repaired nearly everything in the house before she ever spent on a replacement. The repair did not need to be invisible. It needed to last another season, and the few minutes she spent mending were minutes that kept dollars in the envelopes where they belonged. Number 12. The neighbor traded with, never owed. A widow rarely had cash to spare, but she had eggs, mending, garden surplus, and a willingness to mind a neighbor's children. She traded all of it. She sewed for the woman who could spare a chicken, watched the children of the woman who worked the late shift in exchange for a share of canned goods, gave away her surplus tomatoes, and received jars of jam in return. A widow in Arkansas in 1946 ran half the small economy of her life without money changing hands at all. The trading was not charity in either direction. It was a network of women who kept each other afloat with what each had too much of, and it cost no one a cent. Number 11. The installment plan refused. The new way to buy in the 1940s was a little down and a little each month, and a widow who wanted to keep her home learned to say no to it. She knew that the easy payment on a radio or a parlor set was the same kind of small, steady obligation that could crowd out the mortgage in a bad month. A widow in Colorado in 1945 went without a washing machine for 6 years and scrubbed by hand rather than take on a monthly payment she did not control. The thing she did without was not a hardship she resented. It was a string she refused to let anyone tie to her house. And a household with no installment payments could weather a month that would have buried a household full of them. Number 10. The big pot stretched all week. A widow cooked in a way that turned a little meat into many meals. A single soup bone or a small cut of cheap meat became a pot of soup, then a stew thickened with barley, then a hash, then a broth for beans, feeding the family for days off an amount of meat a careless cook would have used in one supper. A widow in Pennsylvania in 1944 fed 5 people for most of a week on a ham bone and what grew in her garden. The cheap cut was not second-rate food. It was 4 dinners hiding inside the price of one, released slowly by a cook who knew that meat was a flavor, not a meal. Number 9. The cash held for emergencies and never touched. Beyond the envelopes for the month's bills, a widow kept a small reserve in cash, hidden in the house, that existed for one purpose only, the true emergency. A doctor in the night, a furnace that died in January, a sudden demand she could not have foreseen. She did not touch it for a sale, for a holiday, or for a want. A widow in Maryland in 1946 kept a roll of bills in a coffee tin behind the canned goods and replaced anything she ever borrowed from it within the month. The reserve was not idle money. It was the difference between an emergency that cost her some cash and an emergency that cost her the house.
Number 8. The children who carried their share. In a widow's house, children were not bystanders to the family's survival. A boy delivered papers before school and handed over most of what he earned. A girl minded younger children, helped with the boarders' rooms, and learned to cook and sew early. A widow in Oklahoma in 1945 ran her household as a small team in which every child over the age of 8 contributed real labor or real money. There was no allowance and no resentment, because the children understood that the family stood or fell together. They were not free labor. They were a household raising itself, and learning at 10 the self-reliance they would lean on at 40. Number 7. The catalog read but not obeyed.
The mail-order catalog arrived, thick with temptation, and a widow read it the way a careful woman reads a thing she has already decided not to buy. She learned the prices, so she would know a fair one when she saw it. She noted what was genuinely useful and what was merely pretty, and she bought almost nothing, because she had long since decided that a want printed on glossy paper was the most expensive thing the postman could bring. A widow in Indiana kept her catalogs for reference and treated the order form as a test she passed every season by setting it aside. The catalog was not a store. It was a parade of wants she had taught herself to watch go by. Number 6. The best bought once and kept for life. When a widow finally did spend on something lasting, she bought the best she could afford one time and then maintained it for decades. A good cook stove, a solid sewing machine, a well-made winter coat. A widow in Vermont in 1943 bought a treadle sewing machine that was still earning her alteration money in 1968. The cheap version, replaced every few years, would have cost her far more across the same span. She did not buy quality out of vanity. She had done the arithmetic and found that the well-made thing, cared for, was the cheapest thing in the long run. Number 5. The wants made to wait. A widow almost never bought a thing the day she first wanted it. She made the want wait, a week, a month, a season, and watched most wants quietly die in the waiting. The new curtains, the second pair of good shoes, the small luxury that seemed so necessary on a hard Tuesday, all of it was set aside to be reconsidered later. And later, more often than not, the urgency was gone. A widow in California in 1946 kept a list of things she meant to buy someday and found that crossing them off unbought was its own kind of saving. The waiting was not denial. It was the discovery that most wants are temporary and only the budget is permanent. Number 4. The appearance of having nothing. A widow who was quietly managing did not let the street know it. She wore her good coat carefully and made it last, kept her struggles behind her own door, and never gave the neighbors, the relatives, or the salesman a reason to think there was anything to be had from her. A widow in Nebraska in 1944 paid her mortgage down ahead of schedule and still wore the same mended Sunday dress for years, because what no one knew, no one could ask her for. The plainness was not shame. It was a quiet wall that kept the borrowers and the schemers and the curious all on the far side of it. Number 3. The income that did not depend on one source. The widows who kept their homes were the ones who never let their survival rest on a single thing. The room brought rent, the hens brought eggs, the needle brought sewing money, the garden brought food, and if any one of them failed, the others carried the month. A widow in Washington in 1945 had 4 small incomes and would have told you that not one of them could have kept her, but together they were unbreakable. The many small streams were not a sign of scraping by. They were a deliberate defense, a household built so that no single misfortune could ever be the last one. Number 2. The work that never stopped. A widow keeping a home did not have idle hours, and she did not waste the ones she had. The evening by the lamp was for mending and alterations. The summer was for the garden and the canning. The slow winter weeks were for sewing she could sell and for letters that brought in a little piecework. A widow in Michigan in 1946 turned nearly every hour the children were asleep into either a small income or a saved expense. The constant work was not joyless drudgery. It was a woman who understood that time was the one asset she owned outright, and she refused to let a single hour of it sit on the shelf producing nothing.
Number 1. Spend less than comes in, every single month. That is the whole of it. Not the envelopes, not the border, not the garden or the ledger. None of the 29 habits above mean a thing without this one underneath them all. Eleanor Pruitt knew exactly what came into her house each month, down to the egg money, and she made certain that what went out was always less, even if the gap was only $1 or $2. That small, defended gap, held open month after month through years that would have broken a careless woman, paid the mortgage, raised 3 children, and finally burned the deed clean. There was no secret beneath it. There was a gap, and Eleanor held the gap open for 27 years, and the gap kept the house. It is the plainest sentence anyone has ever spoken about money, and it has always been the truest. None of these habits required a good income, a kind bank, or any luck at all. They required attention, and the refusal to let a hard year decide the rest of your life. Eleanor Pruitt stood in her doorway in the spring of 1944, holding a telegram that should have cost her the house. And she did not sell, and she did not borrow against tomorrow, and she did not give up the one thing she could not get back. She went inside, sat at the kitchen table, opened her book, and began counting. She did that every Friday night for the rest of her life, and when she died, the deed was clean, and the children were grown, and not one of them ever fully understood how close it had come, because she never told them, and they never thought to ask. These habits did not die because they stopped working. They died because they were so ordinary that no one believed they were worth saving. The envelopes were thrown out with the old shoeboxes. The ledgers went into the trash with the kitchen tables. But the arithmetic never changed, and the gap is still there, waiting for anyone willing to do what Eleanor did at her kitchen table on a hard night in 1944. Count what comes in, hold the gap open, and refuse for as long as it takes to ever let it close. Before you go, tell me one thing in the comments. Was there a woman in your own family, a grandmother, a great-aunt, a mother, who held a household together against the odds? And did she have a quiet way with money that the rest of the world has forgotten? A habit, a rule, a small discipline that kept the family afloat. Write it down below. Somewhere in this comment section is a piece of wisdom worth more than anything a bank will ever tell you, and the only way the rest of us will ever hear it is if you take a moment to remember it out loud.